Hi guys, this is Caroline Zwick from carolineswick.com, and this is the first video of my interview series called Find Your Voice, which is basically meant to give you a private insight into how different people out there have found their own voice and have used it to create a career and a life for themselves that they truly love. Today I have the pleasure to be here with Isabel Foxen Duke. Hi Isabel!
Hello, happy to be here.
Great, I'm happy you're here too. Isabel is an emotional eating expert, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her business herself.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be doing this interview with you. I know, Caroline, I've told you a little bit about my story, so to speak, in the past, and how I got to where I am now. But basically, today I work with men who struggle with emotional eating, struggle with their relationships with their bodies, struggle with relationships with food. And that really ultimately came out of my own personal experience, my own personal struggle with my body, my relationship with food, etc. It was an incredibly painful, long process of, trying to, sort of get my shit together or figure things out in this area of my life. It was so painful. Years and years of hating my body, dieting obsessively, binge eating in the middle of the night secretly, hoping no one found me. And through that whole period, I also simultaneously was trying to think about what I wanted to do with my life. And a big, huge part of figuring out what I wanted to do with my life was sort of interacted with this food problem, because I felt like I would never be able to accomplish or succeed in other areas until I figured out the food problem. And when I sort of flipped that on its head and said, well, why don't you sort of go for whatever you want in life, go for what makes you happy before you figure out the food problem, unless sort of, if you can sort of keep what you think is your biggest problem maybe isn't your biggest problem as much as it is in your own head, and just sort of go for what you want now before you figure out whatever obstacle you think is keeping you from moving forward. That was the moment where I started writing about food. I started putting myself out there on the internet. I started, getting involved with, various different groups with women, and just sort of throwing myself into the politics of this whole issue, and ultimately becoming a health coach. And that is, I realized, was the answer to my food problem, was actually just sort of putting myself out there and sort of being authentic and just sort of going for what I want, as opposed to holding myself back until I get whatever issue I'm dealing with under control. Ultimately, through that process, I ended up healing my relationship with food. So that's sort of long, but kind of short.
Answer. I love your answer, and I love, that you're so open with what you're going through and with what you've been faced with, because I think a lot of women are going through the same type of issues where they are putting their life on hold because of the weight, because of some sort of problem that they haven't figured out that's really keeping them from, being happy at the end of the day.
Right. It's kind of like the Sarah Jenks. I mean, I worked with Sarah Jenks, and she was incredibly influential and was sort of getting me over that sort of final hump. In the sense of, I felt like I knew so much about this area. I had come so far in my relationship with food and my body before I started working with her, but I still felt like I had something that I had to figure out before I could, I had to lose 10 pounds. I had to, cross the finish line. I had to graduate from my food problems before I could, do what I wanted professionally, or, even, do what I wanted in other areas of my life, go ask a guy out on a date, whatever. So that was sort of really the sort of last leg of things for me, was sort of saying, okay, my food's imperfect, my weight is, not what I think it should be, but what if I just started putting myself out there and just being authentic and writing on the internet, blogging, sort of not being afraid to put videos of myself out there and just sort of just go for what I really want, go for my professional dreams anyway, even though I'm not perfect or there yet. And the second I started doing that, my food calmed down. The second I started just having a life everything that was wrong with my food just like didn't matter and disappeared.
Yeah.
It was an amazing sort of, I call it counterintuitive eating.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, it sounds like you were almost like pretending like everything was exactly how you wanted it to be, like namely like, you know, your body and like your food issues, and like not issues, but your food challenges, like almost like pretending like they were not there yet, or that they weren't there at all.
Right.
And by like being exactly who you wanted to be, all of the problems that you were facing sort of fell away on their own.
Exactly. Like when I stopped making my life all about my imperfections, which for me were my weight and my relationship with food. Like those were my problems. Like that's where I was failing. That was my fatal flaw, was my relationship with food for many years. And when I just decided that fatal flaw was that I wasn't going to let that stop me. When I just decided that I was just not going to give it that much power to keep me from moving forward with what my real goals were, that was when the fatal flaw disappeared, magically. The fatal flaw disappeared when I just decided it wasn't important anymore, you know? When I decided to sort of take its power away from it.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, and from my own experience and from my experience with my clients as well, I've seen that happening over and over, you know, where we think that we have to be perfect in order to do anything at all, or to start like a new path, or to switch paths, or whatever it may be. And it's that kind of, you know, like letting go of perfectionism, and for me, like embracing wholeness in exchange for, you know, that never-ending pursuit for some sort of perfectionist ideal that we've at one point created in our own heads and made that the story that we're telling ourselves over and over.
Totally. Perfectionism is like devil's playground, you know, as far as I'm concerned. Like, I feel like if I'm fighting anything in my website, anything in my blog, anything with my coaching practice, it's perfectionism. It's like the degree to which you shame yourself for not being perfect is the degree to which you are going to continue to act out in behaviors that are unhelpful to you or unhelpful to you, and to the degree to which you're going to not live your life and make excuses for not, you know, making your life big and lavish and wonderful and, like, you know, fulfilling your dreams, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that is, I think that we live in a world where it's very easy to get caught up in all of the ways in which we're wrong, or we're not ready yet, or, you know, we still have this thing to work on. Like, like, what if you were just done working on yourself and could just be, you know, like, like, what if you could just, you know, just decide that you were just fine the way you were, and, like, enjoy and move forward, assuming that you're actually perfect for whatever opportunity you're pursuing, whether that be finding a man or finding a job. Yeah.
And would you say that was, like, when you realized that, you know, like, that you were really putting everything else on hold before your weight was a certain number, was that sort of the turning point for you when you know, were finding your own voice?
Totally, because I was scared to be honest and authentic. I was scared to be myself and be imperfect. If you're scared to be imperfect, it's very difficult to be who you are. Yeah. You know, how can you find your voice if you're afraid of fucking up? It's impossible. So, you know, like, there are so many people out there. I now have people who always come to me and say, "Oh, I'm thinking about starting a blog. I'm thinking about, you know, putting such and such thing on the internet. I'm thinking about starting writing something or creating a show or whatever. But I feel like I should, you know, get this done first, or I feel like
I'll do it when this and this happens."
Right, or they're not polished enough, they're not good enough, whatever. And, you know, sometimes my writing myself is stronger than others, and it's okay. You know, like, I feel like sometimes the magic happens when it happens, and ultimately, it's not gonna happen unless I put it out there. So why don't I? It's always a risk. There's always risk involved, and you just kind of have to take it. Otherwise, you're just going to be sitting in your house by yourself, like, depressed, not creating the life that you want, and probably eating, you know, chocolate chip cookies. Yeah. So,
yeah. So how would you say? And I know you touched already on this a little bit beforehand, but how would you say, like, the other areas in your life were impacted by whether or not you had found your voice, or you were really pursuing something that was authentic to you. And the way I like to think of other areas in your life, that would be love, like work, love, health, and play.
Mm-hmm. So play, they all changed. I mean, they all certainly changed when I decided that I was just going to like sort of screw it and be myself. I think for me, finding my voice definitely had this element of I have to let go of what I think I'm supposed to be in order to be who I am. And that was, it definitely impacted my love life in the sense of being okay with being a person who not everyone's going to love, but the right person will love. I think that was a big thing for me, like being able to like be imperfect for 100 men is really not a big deal as long as you're perfect for one. And and then same with so in my work life, I definitely live by I'd rather just be out there and be authentic and being myself than nail it and get it right every time. And I think that that's incredibly tiring and incredibly stressful to kind of put that sort of pressure on yourself, especially in an industry where you're expected to produce content on a regular basis.
Yeah, and like knowing that like the post that you write will speak to the people that need to hear it, and not to like the whole entire world.
Totally. Yeah. Exactly. And like it's okay. Like whoever reads it, whoever gets something out of it or doesn't is okay. And like there's always one of the great things about I think being a writer, being a creative person, is that there's always more opportunity to create. You need to get an A on every assignment. So yeah. So that's sort of my final message is relinquishing. If you're not okay with being imperfect, you're just going to end up doing nothing.
Yeah.
Basically, is sort of what I learned for myself.
Yeah.
And I do a lot more. I accomplish a lot more when I am okay with being imperfect.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, like the way I think about it is that we look at our own work a lot of times through the eyes of some sort of like strict external observer. But we don't really see our own work and our own life through our own eyes anymore, and therefore we can never reap the fruits that really grow in our own lives already, right?
Totally. When I do interviews for people, I always get off the interview thinking, oh, well, that sucked. I did a horrible job.
Yeah.
And then I go back and I listen
now.
to the interview. I know. Probably going to. Not that I think that right now. But then I'll go back to the interview like a few days after it's actually been published, and I'll be like, wow, like I actually said some interesting things. Like maybe I actually helped people. Maybe that was actually valuable.
Yeah.
I think that that's very common and very true. It's really easy to beat yourself up sort of in the moment of like trying to create or produce because you feel so much tension and stress, like this has got to be perfect and awesome. And then 2 weeks later when you don't care about it anymore, maybe you come across something you created that you were putting so much stress and tension on yourself and you thought it sucked, and you go back to it and you're like, oh, that was actually awesome. And I like look at it from like a non-judgmental place, and I just am like, oh, I wonder what this is saying. It ends up being really valuable. People are into it.
Yeah, that actually gets me to my next question. I think it's a perfect lead into it. What would be your like some advice? Like if you had to give one piece of advice to people who are watching, who are hungry to find their own voice, what would be your piece of advice that you feel like maybe you tell yourself on a daily basis, or that sort of made that one big switch in the mindset that you had approaching different areas of your life?
The biggest mindset change I think that I made outside of, again, relinquishing imperfection. I mean, I think that that's huge. The biggest mindset change was I think it's just sort of the idea of sort of being an act. I mean, I really do think it kind of boils down to the imperfection, just being in action and just putting yourself out there and just acknowledging risk. Like acknowledging that risk is a factor in creating any kind of reward in your life. That is something that I think that I had to grapple with. And for me, the way that I was able to grapple with risk was making myself okay with the worst case scenario. which maybe is like a pessimist's point of view, but for me it was like huge. Like, okay, well, can I be okay with the fact that like maybe everyone's going to hate this and everyone's going to think it sucked?
Mm-hmm.
What really is going to happen? Probably not that much. It's really not the end of the world. Like, next week I'll do something and like they'll have a completely different opinion and no one's going to give a shit or remember. So, you know, I think that for me, I don't know, that could go either way. You know, some people disagree with me, but like for like somebody like me who's just very like logic, rational, like control brain, it's a lot easier for me to take a risk if I really like work out in my mind that what the downside of the risk really is and kind of get okay with it. Like get an acceptance about it.
Yeah. And I think if you really spend some time thinking about the worst case scenario and like maybe even like writing it down, I think you'll see that like your mind can sometimes go crazy and like make the worst case scenario so big and so crazy. And once you actually think about it in a more realistic way, like what you just said, like the worst case scenario really is like people won't like what I wrote.
Yeah.
You know, and like
that's it. Like period. Like it's not like people won't like that I wrote and then they'll come and kill me in the middle of the night. Like it's just that. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I like that strategy. I'll try it. All right.
Controversial one, but it works for me.
Yeah. And that's all that matters. You know, I think that's what authentic living is all about, you know, is really finding things that work for you and applying those tools on a consistent basis and like taking small consistent steps on a regular basis. They don't have to be these like huge things and like these huge like innovative new strategies, or like you don't have to, you know, follow every single suggestion that anyone has ever given you, but pick out the ones carefully that really work for you and just follow those on a consistent basis. I think is another huge one.
Totally, 100%. I'm super into that. It's like, okay, this is a strategy that works for me. I'm going to make it work. I'm going to make it work for me on a regular basis. And it's okay if it's not the strategy that everyone says. Like, I think there's room for individuality in self-help, you know?
Yeah.
And that's totally cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love it.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
No problem. It was my pleasure, Carolyn. I very much, you know, enjoyed being on the show. You know that I like love you dearly as a friend and a coach. You've coached me through so much. It's kind of amazing to be on your show.
Thank you so much. Well, for all of you guys who want to get in touch with Isabel, I'll paste her website underneath this video, and you can check her out yourself. She's amazing.
Yay!
All right, guys. Bye.